coming from musical.
John Friesen, cello.
Paul Richard.
Jeff Gillian, piano, piano accompanying.
Leslie Delphic on choral.
Patty Bourne, music education.
Nice meeting you.
I was wondering, starting off, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and why you want this position.
What? I don't like talking about myself, but I can tell you. But I can tell you what attracted me to the position and why I applied to the position. When I was doing my research, one of the things that really attracted me about this position was looking at the faculty that was here and having a full-time faculty in applied studios. It's something that at Hofstra right now I don't have, and I found that while the quality of teaching in studios is very high, that there is a level of commitment that comes with having full-time faculty members in applied studios that cannot be replicated by adjunct faculty. And so for me, seeing that, there was one element, just the quality of the faculty that's in place here that really attracted me to the position. Pacific Northwest, obviously it's very beautiful here, and I've lived the last 9 years in New York now. New York is great, but it can also be very stressful, and looking for a little bit of a change in that arena as well. Also the opportunity just to build this orchestral program. I researched the university as a whole, and the music department in general, and the music department as being part of the college here, College of Fine Arts. I foresaw a lot of potentially very interesting collaborations happening within the department, within the college, and in this area as well. So those are some of the elements that really attracted me to the position.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question now, open it up to the committee and the faculty as a whole here. Where do you see our orchestra program right now? What do you think works and what do you think could be enhanced?
From having done a rehearsal yesterday, one of the things that I noticed is that overall the technical ability level of the students is very high, and I think that fundamentally there's like everything is very sound. So it's a great foundation to start working with, and I think that some of the areas of improvement can happen in fine-tuning orchestral playing technique, really getting all the players in the orchestra to really understand their roles as musicians in the orchestra, how to function as a wind or a brass player in a section, as a principal player, as a second player. Same for the strings, how to really function as a section. I think some work can be done there. And in a sense, it's not that hard to achieve when fundamentally so many things are already correct. When students are technically set up correct, and that's really a testament to the excellence of teaching that's going on here in the studios. And I think also really, building the visibility of the program, taking the orchestra to the next level, not only technically, but also just in the recognition within the larger community and in the area here, so to help bolster recruiting. Some initial impressions, and I'd be more than happy to go into more detail.
Along the lines of recruiting, what are some of the things that you've done at your present institution, and what are some of the ways that you would see building the visibility of the group?
I think one of the most important things is just to go out in the community and building good relationships with the local teachers, whether it's high school teachers or private teachers, people that are teaching high school level students, building personal relationships with those people. So going out into the schools, doing workshops, clinics, honor groups, those kind of things. But I think it's also very important to try to get high school students as much to campus as possible. It's one of the things that worked very well for me at Hofstra, and which unfortunately due to budget cuts, could no longer continue, was a full day. I started out with a day of strings, where the entire string faculty was with me on campus on a Saturday, and where we invited local high school students to come to campus for the entire day. We did, the studio faculty did master classes, then they split off, and the violinists, our violin teacher took the violinist, viola, cello, double bass, and they did some group classes, and then there was chamber music coaching in the early afternoon, and at the end of the day, I brought all the students and the faculty together, supplemented with some Hofstra students, and we just read through some string orchestra rep. It was really very successful in that we ended up getting several students already the next year to come to Hofstra directly based on that contact with the applied faculty and just getting that experience of being on campus. So we did a similar day for winds brass percussion as well. And of course, it's expensive. We have all of our private studio faculty are affiliate faculty members, so they had to be remunerated for the time that day, and that started becoming an expensive proposition. And so it's unfortunately why I could not continue that. But I think it's really important to have high school students to be on campus as much as possible, so they feel comfortable here. They get to know the faculty, they get to know the environment, so that when they make the decision to go, once they make the decision to go to college, they're more likely to choose the place where they already feel comfortable, where it's not, that major step, or that major uncertainty that they step into. So those are some initial elements that definitely I think you'd like to do.
Our president's wife, Dr. Bruce Shepard, Cindy Shepard, has established this wonderful program called Compass to Campus, where she brings literally hundreds of fifth grade students to this campus to say, hey, if you really pay attention, you too could go to college.
Right.
So
yeah, and I think, starting even at a young age, and obviously to do a day like this, to mix it between middle school and high school, it might become difficult. But why not do a similar thing for middle school students as well, and get them in young?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like tobacco companies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with opera at Hofstra? I know your chair has talked about the fact that under the circumstances of timing, it's tricky to get orchestral students to participate, but she mentioned that they do because they like to work with you. Can you talk about that experience a little bit?
Yeah, so at Hofstra we've got a pretty unique situation. We're an undergraduate-only institution, and we put on a fully staged opera production with orchestra once a year. Fall and spring, so we're in a semester system, so fall and spring semester, there's Opera Studio, where our opera director, who is she's an opera director, she doesn't direct theater, but she's a stage person, not a musician. Together with a pianist coach, the two of them run this during the academic year, the scenes program. And then from there, I get involved towards the end of the spring semester for auditions for the main stage production, which also always happens over January term. So we start rehearsals January 2nd, and the production goes on to 3 performances the first weekend after classes come back for spring semester. It's about a 5-week rehearsal period where we go Monday through Saturday. And for me, usually my days go from 10 or 11 in the morning until about 10 at night. Rehearsing the orchestra and rehearsing with the singers and rehearsing with the chorus. But the main stage opera production is not a class, so the students do not get credit for that. Students also don't get paid to be in it. It's purely a voluntary thing they do. The orchestra I just recruit from my main orchestra at Hofstra. Given the size limitation of the pit, I usually can fit about 30 people in do like a Handel opera. I need less players. Monteverde di Coronazione di Pochea. Most of the pit was taken up by continual instruments, and I just did it with quintet, string quintet. But so the orchestra players, they also give up basically their January break to come and rehearse 3 days a week for 3 hours, and then once we get into the final week, dress rehearsal and tech. I actually do orchestra techs, which is also pretty unusual. Usually it's piano tech and then orchestra dress and go into the performances. But for the singers and for the orchestra players, it's good to have that extra rehearsal. So the production week, we actually have rehearsals 4 nights in a row, and then do 3 performances 3 days in a row. The students absolutely love it. It has mainly contributed to our vocal department. We have a very strong voice faculty at Hofstra, but every year now we've sent at least 3 or 4 graduating seniors to top vocal master's programs. We've sent people to Manhattan School, Paul, Boston Conservatory, New England Conservatory, Bard, San Francisco Conservatory. So, it's a highly successful program. And most of the time, the reason why these people get in is just because of the experience that they get singing a main stage role as an undergraduate in the original language. Someone would do like Mozart, Mozart or something like that. We do it in Italian. L'incoronazione, we did that in Italian.
And as a follow-up, if you could move things along here as far as opera and incorporate that into what you do, can you talk a little bit about what you might like to see happen?
Yeah, with the committee, and actually also with Chris, we talked about that. One of the things that I'd like to see happen for the orchestra program here, since the orchestra there's a pedagogic function, there's a pedagogic responsibility that we have towards the players in the orchestra. And so in a 4-year program, you need to be able to expose them to a wide variety of repertoires and really teach them about different styles and playing skills and all of that. So to take a third or maybe a maximum of half of the players and do a quarter where you prepare with those players for the opera production, it really does a major disservice, I think, to the players that get left out at that point. And at the same time, one of the things I also realized here, evaluating the program, is that there's really a need for a string orchestra. So for the strings to be really working in depth on string repertoire. It's a vast body of repertoire. But if the second ensemble can exist as a string ensemble / chamber orchestra, then that ensemble could also fulfill the need as the opera orchestra ensemble, and it's smaller in size, and at the same time, none of the players that would usually play in the symphony orchestra then would be left out, because the symphony orchestra would still function at the same time and keep doing its repertoire. And I think it's for the highly committed students and people that are really interested in being part of an opera orchestra. It gives them an opportunity to do that without taking opportunity away from other students. So that's how I would envision that to happen, given that we're not doing it over a break.
And we've had the opposite experience in the sense that the highly committed students and some of the less highly committed students have tended to see the opera as a cross to bear for a few weeks when they've got all their other classes and everything else to go. And so how would you get them excited about this opportunity? In as much as you've gotten students to come during their break and give that up, it sounds like you have some magic in that regard. But
I know it's I think I think it comes down to programming great repertoire in general, and I think if the students get to play really good music, first of all, and secondly, where they every single time they go into a rehearsal feel like they're learning something, they're having a great time at the same time, and they feel inspired walking out of rehearsal, I don't think then that they're going to say no to an opportunity to get more of that. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is just inspiring students every single time step on the podium and inspiring with great repertoire and a great attitude, and that they can walk away every single time knowing that they've learned something. And if that's not the case, then then it's problematic. And then we're not doing our job as teachers. then they might as well start playing professional orchestra.
Concerning repertoire, our own brass people in general, like to play lots and loud, and sometimes whole quarters go by where they don't. And I was wondering how, because most of the lots and loud pieces are horrifically difficult for the string. So how do you balance that in repertoire
Right.
choices?
Well, first of all, I think that the strings here are good enough to tackle that repertoire. I mean, like rehearsing with like say, 650. I really do believe. I think like yesterday. I mean, I was hesitant about Tchaikovsky's Six. I mean, it's a difficult work. I mean, and it poses a lot of problems. But I think the orchestra did a very fine job playing it, and playing it well, and being able to respond very quickly to what I was asking from them in rehearsal. I'm a trumpet player myself, so I know the feeling of counting 180 bars and having to come in at 181 and the conductor at 179 saying like, oh, let's go back.
Yeah.
But as a brass player, obviously you always want to play. As an orchestral brass player, you know that that's not going to be the case. So first of all, I think as a brass player, you just have to enter the orchestra with the mentality that you're not playing brass quintet. You're sitting there as an orchestral brass player. And I know when I first arrived at Hofstra, the orchestra was really a chamber orchestra. I had 35 players in the orchestra, so it was small. So I was not doing Mahler 8 with them. And I remember the trumpet players coming to me, and we're doing Mozart Symphony 39. And they knew that I was a trumpet player, and they came up to me and they said, like, look, we're kind of bored. Like, would it be okay if we miss like the next few rehearsals while you just work with the strings and the woodwinds? And I said, you know what? I'll tell you something else. I said, why don't we meet tomorrow for a 2-hour sectional, and I'll teach you guys how to play Mozart on the trumpet. And this is just playing octaves and fifths. And after 2 hours, they walked away, and they went straight to the practice room because they realized how much work they still had to do on playing octaves and fifths in tune with the correct type of attack, how they had to listen to the timpani and how the timpani had to adjust his playing style to them, and realizing how they fit it into the chord. And there's a whole lot more that comes with playing brass in an orchestra. And I think once you can show brass players that, look, there's a lot more to it than just playing the notes loudly that are on the page, and you have to listen very actively and realize where you need to fit in. And if the students run with that and realize the value of that, then I think they will come to rehearsal with enthusiasm, and they'll be there without being bored. One of the things that I always did as a trumpet player, especially with works where I didn't have to play a lot, was I would bring a score. And maybe that's how I ended up being a conductor. But I sat with a score in rehearsal. And, touch-it movements. I had my score open. And that's something that I would definitely recommend to the brass as well. I'm like, look, guys, why don't you bring a score? And, make your time valuable. At the same time, like I think as a conductor, you just also have to be cognizant of the fact that you cannot demand, the players to sit there for 2 hours and play, 4 notes. If you're doing Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, where the trombone plays 5 notes or 6 notes in the whole concerto, you have to be flexible in accommodating the students and just say like, I know that these 2 hours of your time can be better spent, in the practice room, and or if there's a movement with a brass asked, you start with that, and then you excuse them from the rest of the rehearsal. With brass and percussion, you have to be somewhat flexible there.
Our former director of that came here, having played principal trumpet in the Seattle Symphony for 13 years, and was told, you don't have a doctorate, so I don't think we can tenure you. But as principal trumpet of the Seattle Symphony, I watched some of the world's great guest conductors when they came through Seattle. And I wasn't just sitting there playing my part.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot to be said for what you just said.
From a to switch gears on you just a little bit. You know, part of this position is to help out in the academic areas. What do you think your strengths are in academic courses?
Right. You know, definitely on the history side, I think I have a lot to offer. You know, since I have a master's in musicology and I finished a coursework for PhD in musicology. Mostly in repertoire ranging from the Baroque onwards. You know, definitely, you know, early Baroque and Renaissance medieval music is not a strength of mine at all. You know, my tastes in music and my knowledge of music kind of evolves along the paths of the evolution of the orchestra. But you know, I feel very comfortable teaching music appreciation courses, part of the history sequence, things like that. The other thing, and Chris and I talked a little bit about that in our meeting earlier, one of the courses that I love teaching is ear training. I really think that like boot camp, I call it boot camp for musicians. It's, you know, if you can't read notes, if you can't read clefs, and if you can't sing in tune, you're not going to be able to do it on your instrument either. You know, I personally come from a continental European conservatory tradition. You know, when my final examination was 8 tonal 7 clefs and changing meters every other bar or every bar. You know, not that that's necessary to, you know, for every single musician to possess those skills, but definitely like a very stringent, rigorous training in ear training. And that's why I love teaching that as well, because I really feel like it's pushing the musicians in the right direction, and through ear training you can create right away the correct practicing habits, you know, that translate directly into the instrument. You know, I was a theory TA when I did my doctorate at the University of Minnesota, so theory sequence, I feel comfortable teaching that. And then personally, I mean, my presentation that I gave yesterday on Mahler, which is based on my master's thesis, I have a personal research interest in the music of late 19th century and early 20th century music, especially Viennese. I spent a year in Vienna, so doing topical courses on that. I've done some seminars on all the Mahler symphonies. I've done a seminar on Beethoven symphonies. Done a seminar on the orchestral literature, but at the same time tied to the evolution of the orchestra and the evolution of the art of conducting. So topical courses like that are definitely of great interest to me to teach that. And then obviously being a conductor, teaching conducting. That's a no-brainer. That's passionate interest of mine.
So how many of your ear training students actually make progress? Because my colleague, Professor Danielle and I have spoken frequently about the fact that it's really frustrating. Either they can or they can't hear.
I think it's, well, the students have to commit to it, you know, and it's like probably one of the courses where, you know, you just put the whip on them. And it's like you just have to force the students to practice and practice hard. And there's really no other way to go about it. I like to think that I was successful teaching ear training in Hofstra. I mean, I after one semester, and you know, I come from a fixed DOE system, you know, from the conservatory. I was forced to teach movable DOE at Hofstra, which is fine. I mean, I just ended up clef transposing everything myself. But
Interesting.
But I did, my approach to ear training, you know, whether it's movable DOE or fixed DOE, is that it's about recognizing intervals.
Yes.
And memorizing intervals. And once the students know intervals, it doesn't matter whether it's movable or fixed DOE or what clef they're reading. So after one semester, I had the final examination for the students was a page-long sight reading excerpt that they had 10 minutes to prepare, which was in treble bass and alto clef with changing meters.
Wow.
And students afterwards came up to me like subsequent years and told me that they basically did not have to practice ear training for the next 2 semesters. Which I thought was unfortunate because I got the direction and then there it stopped. But, I know that some people come in with, who cannot even match pitch. My question is, what are you doing as a music major when you can't match pitch? But at the same time, I think that, even when I was in conservatory, there was percussionists that could not match pitch either. It's pretty hard to match pitch on a bass drum, it's a dedication. And I think that's what it comes down to. If the students are really dedicated and they're willing to learn and they understand the importance of, passing the class and doing well in that class for, the next 50, 60 years of their lives as professional musicians, once they understand that, then I think they will put in the effort to do it. And if they're not willing to do that, to me, ear training is one of those classes where, that's where you just, like I said, boot camp. That's where you cut the dead wood out and go from there.
Solfeggio works very well in Europe, where it's taught at the same time that they're learning their native language. But I am amazed that our theory faculty has brainwashed our students into accepting that system, as opposed to 1, 3, 5, C, E, G, or whatever. So it works here. But Movo don't, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for that.
A few minutes in the back of the band.
In your lecture yesterday, you showed I was interested in all the names of the old conductors of the time of Mahler, and you commented on new ones and recordings, and I just wonder, what is your legacy? Who have your teachers been, and what will be your conducting style, and how will you teach conducting, and I don't know that much about conducting, but what legacy will you bring to our university?
Well, I don't really want to talk about a legacy. I've had some very good teachers.
What's your style, and what are your priorities? Or if that's I think one of the dangers of teaching conducting is that, and very often it's necessary. When you teach conducting in a group setting, in a class setting, for future music educators, and you've got 15, 20 students in a class, obviously one of the things you need to do is you have to evaluate the students on how they do, which means you have to have some strict parameters on which you can evaluate them. And I think once you have that concept in place, you can explain the many conducting methodologies or textbooks that are out there. What I found in my personal experience is that teaching conducting through a textbook can never do justice to the art of conducting. It's not even a theory, but it's an expression of a physical nature, and every single person is built differently, and everybody's got a different psyche, and I think both your personal physical and psychological makeup will eventually dictate how you conduct and how you move your body. So when I teach conducting, I teach some very basic fundamental concepts of movement that are always tied into concepts from the natural world that students can recognize very immediately. Concepts such as gravity, resistance, light, heavy, dense, opaque, and then tie that into an understanding of how their body moves. I use a lot of analogies from things like yoga, breathing, and how breathing influences the body and how it inspires the body, and really for the students to discover their bodies. And I think that's one of the most difficult elements, especially for young conductors, I think, is to make their body function in a musical way. Most people feel uncomfortable moving their bodies, especially in front of a group of So once they can find a comfort zone for their own body and realize that when they make a gesture, that it's a gesture that's true to them as persons, both physically and mentally, I think that's the biggest step right there. Conducting a pattern, 3-4-4-4-2-4-5-4, doesn't, that's just mechanics that is really easy to teach. I mean, it's not that hard. To make a pattern musical and to have students think through a pattern is much harder. So that to me is my foundation. That said, I approach conducting, and the way I teach conducting is, I always make the analogy of a toolbox approach. And I always tell the students, like, you know, I had some great conducting teachers that really when I started distilling the lessons that I learned from them, you know, I came to this idea of like being comfortable within your own body and within your own person. But then I would show them video clips of great conductors, and I would, you know, grab a work, let's say Beethoven 5, you know, and I would show Bernstein, Karajan, Kleiber, Mazel, Mehta, just a number of conductors. And I would tell them, like, okay, now grab a conducting method and analyze their conducting based on this method. And what you would find is that all of these great conductors would not pass the basic conducting class based on the way that they move, because they would fail on all these points. But yet they're all considered great conductors. What I tell them is like, look, you know, and I did this for myself. I would go through stages where I would just study the physical movement of a conductor. Like, you know, I would look at Gergiev, and I would look at Schulte, and Karajan, Barenboim, and I would just try to emulate them. And I would just try to mimic them in a mirror and just see, okay, what is it that they do and how does this feel for my body? And there's going to be elements that work for me, and there's going to be elements that don't work for me. I mean, there's no other conductor that can move like Carlos Kleiber. I mean, there's something just so unique about the way he can move his body. It doesn't, you know, so you never want to look like Carlos Kleiber. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't study him. And it just becomes like all these influences together, and then finding yourself as a person is really what defines you as a conductor. And that's, so I don't want to talk about the legacy, you know, how you have these conducting teachers who have like, you know, 40 years of students, you know, in the whole school, and they have developed this method. And for some people it works great. And for other people it doesn't work great, and you don't hear about those students that have gone through that training that have not succeeded as conductors. And I think maybe one of the reasons why they didn't succeed is because they were forced into a method that didn't work for them as a person. And so that's why I really try to avoid straitjacketing students.
I think we have time for one more relatively
May
short.
I? Gustavo Dudamel.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on him?
That's fabulous. I mean, he's definitely someone who's like perfectly comfortable in his own skin, you know, and he's very expressive in his style. You know, and it's amazing the amount of repertoire he does. I mean, I wish I could look at a score like him and just visually memorize it and just soak up scores. You know, and we'll see what the future brings for him. You know, he's still young, and he's going at a very rapid pace, and I'm very excited to hear him 20, 30 years from now and see where his musicality has grown.
What about his conducting style, his use of the right hand, as opposed to the non-use of his right hand? In fact, I saw a concert in San Francisco with Michael Tilson Thomas where he did not use a baton at all.
A baton, like, I mean, I've seen Gergiev conduct a concert with a toothpick. You know, a baton is a tool that can be used, and if you know how to use it effectively, it's great. And if you don't need it, you don't need it. I mean, I've conducted concerts without a baton. You know, sometimes because I just forgot it. Sometimes I brought my baton on stage and I ended up putting it down for a slow movement.
Yeah.
And then I realized by the end of the fourth movement of the symphony that I still hadn't picked it up again. You know, and really it doesn't matter. You know, the whole like division of labor between left and right. It's also, I think, a very dogmatic approach. And whatever works, works. And as long as the players can follow you, and as long as you can get your artistic vision of the work, the musicality to come out and the players respond to it, I mean, it really doesn't matter what you do.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Dr. Emil, I'd like to thank you for a very compelling and comprehensive discussion.